We've gone into a little bit of depth now, but what I want to finish with is a bit of a summary. When you're answering a simple trig equation, so when I say simple trig equation, I mean tan, sine, cos equals, and the ratio, there's really only 3 steps. The first one is you use the sign of the ratio to work out what quadrants you're in. So quadrants is always the first step because you want to know where your answers are going to be. Once you've done that, you need your equivalent acute angle, and that's where we use inverse functions to find what the equivalent acute angle is, remembering that in order to use your calculator for this, you always need to use the positive ratio. The next one is you find your 2 answers, and that uses this diagram down the bottom here, where if we have the equivalent acute angle, which is theta hat, then to find our angles in the second, third, and fourth quadrant, we use 180 minus theta, 180 plus theta, and 360 minus theta. So let's do these ones the way that I would do them in an exam. Here we've got the 2 bits of information. We have a positive ratio and the magnitude is 1 on root 3. This is tan, so because it is the positive ratio, I'm going to be in the first and third quadrants. I'm going to use my knowledge of exact values to get the theta hat here, but you can use inverse tan, but I know that theta hat, the equivalent acute angle, is 30 degrees. But my answers, the ones in the first and third quadrant, are going to be 30 degrees, because that's the first one. But in the third quadrant over there, it's going to be 180 plus 30 degrees. And so my answers are 30 and 210 degrees. Here we've got cos theta equals negative 1 over 2. So again, up into my quadrants. This time I've got a negative ratio, but it's cos. Cos is negative in the second and third quadrants. So I use my knowledge of exact values to say that the equivalent acute angle is equal to 45 degrees. But we can use inverse cos and our calculators to find that out if we need to. But to find my answers, one in the second and third quadrants, theta is going to be equal to 180 minus 45 and 180 plus 45. So it's going to be 135 degrees and 225 degrees. The last one is tan. And even though it's negative 1, which isn't a fraction or a surd, does have an exact value, we treat it exactly the same way. Get into my quadrants. This time tan is negative, so I'm going to be in the second and fourth quadrant. I know that my equivalent acute angle is 45 degrees, because the tan of 45 degrees is 1. And then the angles that I need are going to be in the second quadrant and in the fourth quadrant. So they will be 135 degrees and 315 degrees. Now, all of my examples have used exact values, so where the angle is nice. But even if the angle isn't nice, for instance, if we had the sine of theta is equal to 0.4, the working is exactly the same. The answers are just a little bit more hideous. When you get your quadrants here, we've got a positive ratio for sine, so that's first and second. It's this step, the equivalent acute angle, that can be a little bit hard to find. But you do need to get your calculators and just put that in there. Now, when you're using your calculators to find these out, we're using degrees. So please make sure your calculator is in degrees. When you work that out, which I'll have to in a second, you're just going to get some hideous number. But the working is still the same. When you end up finding your answer, you still need to move around the quadrants. Now I need the first and second quadrant, which means it's really just going to be theta hat here, because that's the first quadrant. But the next answer is definitely going to be 180 minus whatever that happens to be. So once you work these out, you might want to save them in your calculator, or just remember to use them again to work out what your final answer is. We'll talk about rounding to the nearest minute a little bit later on. It's not super important, so to 1 decimal place is totally fine. So to finish off, all of these questions are done the same way. Use the sign of your ratio to work out what quadrants you're in, remembering it changes depending on the trig function you're using. You find the equivalent acute angle. Most of the time it will be an exact value, but even when it's not, that's pretty easy to do. Just remember to use the positive ratio. And then once you have the equivalent acute angle, you need to find your answers. Your answers are going to be in more than one quadrant. So please try the worksheet that's down below here that is attached. Try those, and then tomorrow we're going to have a look at changing the domain and changing the frequency and how that changes our solution. Good luck.